Okay.
Unfortunately, right before we started recording it, let me know if you can hear it because I can like mute myself when I'm not talking. But
I haven't heard it yet.
okay, good. Some tree services have decided to start cutting the trees outside the
Is it
house.
going
So
now?
yeah, so that's been really nice. It's like a couple houses down, but still, it's like
Okay. So before we get started, I was telling Haley this story, and I feel like I have to tell it to you because it's so
do
like,
you?
yes, it's so of the moment because everybody just with with the quarantine, COVID-19, just everybody having to be indoors. Obviously, Zoom, we're using it now, is like this ubiquitous thing that people are holding meetings in. And I was in a meeting today. It was kind of like a digital fireside chat, and I will eliminate names and companies, but I was in this digital fireside chat, and the moderator, I don't know if he was going to share his screen or what was going on, but all of a sudden, yeah, your face, all of a sudden, porn just starts flashing on the screen.
No.
Yes. And there's maybe 25, 30 people in this in this
It
screen.
wasn't even like a really small thing.
No, it's the founder of the company, this big guest. He's the moderator. They're head of the marketing team, and then like 25 other guests on the Zoom call, and everybody's face is just like, "Oh my god!" But
That's awesome.
yeah, well,
Well, I mean, not for that person, but
Right.
well, and here's the thing: it wasn't his
interesting.
porn. It was not his.
Sure.
There's been hacks in like public Zoom links. So people are
Oh,
coming in, and it's kind of like getting rich rolled. You know what I'm talking about when I say getting rich rolled? Like it'll be a video, and then you get this like kind of fake out, and there's a music video at the end, like "Never Gonna Bring Me Out." You know what I'm saying?
yes.
Okay. So anyway, so it was kind of that situation where somebody put that in the Zoom meeting, and just everybody was on like highlight, like, "Oh my God, what's going on?" But for the first like 10 seconds, you just felt like the deepest sadness and embarrassment for this person.
Yeah.
Like, wow. So hopefully that doesn't happen to us.
Hopefully there's no porn today.
Yeah.
God, wouldn't that be horrible?
I mean, it wouldn't be the worst thing because
It'd be iconic.
it's just the three of us. But if this were live in front of like 30 other individuals, I think we'd have a problem. So anyway, that's a great way to start this episode. But we're here with Tiffany Hanson. So Tiffany, if you can, tell us a little bit about kind of what you do, big broad overview, and then we'll kind of break that down, start at the beginning and work our way back.
Yeah, so I really do a lot of community engagement work, a lot of diversity and inclusion work. And Haley, we were talking about earlier, just a lot of connecting work in the community. So for my full-time job, I work with Luna Language Services. It's a language service company, which means we literally like translate documents from one language to another, or we provide interpreting services. So like if someone spoke Burmese on this podcast, then we would have a Burmese interpreter here to help us to facilitate the conversation. Those are literally the services that Luna provides. My role with them is a lot of education and advocacy and engagement. And so what I get to do is advocate for access to opportunities, access to resources for the limited English proficient community. So what that typically means is advocacy for immigrants and refugees and the deaf and hard of hearing community. So that's what I spend a majority of my daytime hours doing. And then I also am the director of marketing and communications for Indy Pride. And I also do a lot of advocacy for LGBTQ plus people. And then what happens is all of those worlds kind of collide in a lot of really cool different ways. And so I get to bring little pieces of all of the work that I'm doing into every initiative that I'm working on, every event that I'm working on, really any project that I'm doing. And so it's a really fun job, and I spend a majority of my time really working because I enjoy it so much.
Gotcha. And how long have you been at Luna?
I've been with Luna for just a little over 2 years. and about the same amount of time, just actually almost 3 years with Indy Pride.
Gotcha. And what kind of drew you to wanting to do that sort of work, not just with Indy Pride, but specifically with Luna Language Services? Like, was your educational background in language or anything like that?
So my educational background was in communications with an emphasis in public relations. I went to the University of Indianapolis. And when I got out of school, I worked in the hospitality industry for a long time, bartending and waiting tables. And I just got to meet just an abundance of different people, different personalities. When I went into more of a professional setting, a couple of years ago, I was working with a local law firm, and they have 4 different partners, and each partner has a couple of different practice areas of law that they practice. And what that did is it kind of made them like a little general practice law firm without having the overhead of one of the big law firms downtown. So they were a lot more accessible to people at different income levels. They did employment law. And so one of the things that I really focused on, this is where I started to get into all of my grassroots advocacy work and building relationships with community stakeholders. But I started building relationships in the deaf and hard of hearing community, because deaf community members have an even harder time getting jobs than some other populations of people with disabilities. And I don't know what it is. It's interesting, people just have this kind of mental block about how you communicate with a deaf person, and it's different than people who just speak different languages. So when you think about it, if you're talking to somebody who speaks a different language, what do? You talk louder and you talk slower. Right. And you know that that's not going to work with the person who's deaf. And so your brain just like shuts down. And so people are like, well, how could I ever communicate with the deaf person? So how could I ever hire them? And that's where I really started to get interested in some of this anti-discrimination work, understanding some of the layers of why that happens in our community, and trying to find ways that I can plug myself in to provide education to overcome that. And what that sounded like at the time was, rather than being a schmarmy law firm that's like, have you been discriminated against, call our law firm, right? Yeah, right? Like the 3 a.m. commercial. I would do take these education opportunities to tell people, this is what it looks like when someone is doing something unlawful and doing something discriminatory. And this is what it looks like when someone's just being a jerk. And then this is what you can do. This is the power that you have when it is something that's unlawful, right? And so it was just giving people more of that power of knowledge of when that line is crossed and what are their options, and kind of going from there. And on the same side, then I was talking with employers and doing education about, this is what you're doing when you're being discriminatory, and this is what you should do instead. And really, it was more work to lessen discrimination than it was to really to find clients. But what that does is it helps you to build genuine relationships with people in the community. So after a couple of years, I had built a solid relationship with Luna. We had done a couple of different initiatives together, and it was time for me to kind of transition out of the law firm, and they made me an offer, and we've been working together ever since. So it's been really fun and interesting, and it's opened up a lot of doors for me and allowed me to just meet some really incredible people.
Well, it makes total sense why you'd work for Luna. It is just, when I think of Luna, I think of like colorful, inviting, friendly, inclusive. It's all those just lovely things. And it just seems like you fit right in, and like with their mission and what they want to do, which we interviewed
Marina.
Okay, Marina. I'm always scared to say her name because it's such a complicated spelling. But so we know about how great Luna is. But so with all of that said, I know that you have a passion for inclusion and connection and all those things, but I want to bring it back to see, maybe where that came from. So where did you grow up? Are you Hoosier or?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Kokomo, that big city, about an hour north of Indy. I still have a ton of family there. And so it's been interesting. I think coming from a really small, very homogenous community in Indiana, coming to Indianapolis, and especially, like I mentioned in my hospitality work, and then just continuing to meet all of these different people. And I'm a very high empath. My therapist and I talk about it all the time, how I'm always like feeling more for other people than I am for myself. And so I would just get really involved in people's stories, and super interested in things that I could do to help. And it's just really driven me. And I think coming from that, like that place of not growing up in it, and then kind of having like your eyes opened, has been a big driver for me to just continue to self-educate and do everything that I can as I'm kind of moving through my work and my life, really.
Was there any moment in particular that kind of stuck out culturally, that whether it was exposure when you were working in hospitality, coming from that homogenous kind of culture in Kokomo, coming to Indianapolis, where you're just like, oh my gosh, like culture is so cool, right? Or like diversity is so cool. Like, was there a song that you heard or a food that you tried or something that you can kind of point back to?
I think it was just the relationships that you build with people, right? Um, there was this woman, I used to work at Joe's Crab Shack when I was in college down in Greenwood. I don't think it's even open anymore down there. And there was this woman named Blanca that I was taking Spanish in college and had taken some Spanish in high school. And she was taking classes to learn English. And she would bring her note cards to work, and I would bring my note cards to work. And we would sit together in the back, and we would like quiz each other and just like help each other learn our respective languages, right? And it was one of those things where you just see two people, like you're in the experience of two people from very, very different backgrounds, who are essentially like trying to accomplish the same thing, and just coming together to help each other. And it was just one of those, like, in my mind, just a very iconic moment of, gosh, I'd love to recreate this over and over again with people, right? Like finding the commonalities there's always a commonality between people, right? And finding out what that is and building connections has been something that I've been really passionate about. And that's probably one of the most vivid memories that I have of that.
It's interesting when you're explaining that experience, how positive you are about it. I also grew up in a very white, I grew up in a rural community of 4,000 people, but I feel a lot of shame of being so ignorant to, I guess how differently I'm treated from others, or how ignorant I am of just other cultures and that. But you speak so positively about that. Like have you ever had like a moment of just like, oh man, I'm so, unaware.
Very many of them. But if you're gonna be passionate about this, and if you're gonna do this kind of work, you can't look at it that way, right? You really have to look at it as a positive experience every time. And people feel that too, right? Like when you get super weird about something, when you're talking to somebody, they know it, and then they feel awkward, and then there's like this like tension, right? But if you're like, oh, like I never knew that, or tell me more about that, or I'd love to understand that better, or you know what I mean? If you kind of have that attitude in general, then it allows you to do that in a much more seamless way, and allows you to just be genuinely interested in learning new things about people, right? I can think of very many moments, just like many other human beings, where I'm like, I cannot believe I said that, or that I did that, or that I didn't know that. And so I use that to drive me now to be able to have conversations with people on a very regular basis, to, push a little bit more education with someone who may use some terminology that could be offensive to someone, or, you know what I mean? And it's just like, I think about it kind of the way that you're mentioning it, is like, you don't want to come at a person and be like, you're a bigot, can't believe you said that, right? But just like trying to softly explain things to people in a way to help them to understand as well. And I kind of view myself as the same way. Does that make sense?
Definitely. It's like genuine curiosity, I think, at the core of just saying, just being very accepting, and just, I guess, sincerely curious about, okay, I've never experienced that before. Tell me more.
Yeah.
I like that. So you chose to go to UIndy for public relations, and what was the other, community relations and PR. So what drove that decision?
So I originally went to the University of Indianapolis because they have a really great physical therapy program. And my first
Oh.
year, I took like biology 100 and I was like, oh, I don't like this kind of science. Right? Like I like applied sciences, right? And I like things that it's not straight memorization. And so I really loved my psychology classes. I was one class away from getting a minor in psychology. I loved my marketing classes. And I really loved my public speaking class. And I was like, why don't I just major in this? And stayed in that program and just really loved it. I was a part of building the university's television station. They now have an on-campus station. I was part of the team that originally founded that, and just got to meet some really cool people. And I think when I like kind of take that from an overhead view rather than all of the little nitty gritty, I just really love understanding what influences people and how people make decisions, how people think about things. And of course that translates to like marketing or sales or community relations. But I think that in general is what I found that I was more passionate about than biology.
Makes sense. I can relate to that on a deep level, a biological level, if you.
Yes, I love it.
So one of the things that you brought up was just like kind of confrontation, right? Just like how do you come up to and maybe not confrontation in the negative sense, but just like confronting someone on like saying something that's inappropriate or inaccurate, right? Like not necessarily calling them a bigot, but definitely saying, hey, whether you know it or not, you're being discriminatory. Right. How were you having those conversations early on with employers without it getting combative or kind of creating this weird tension? Right.
Yeah, I find that it's a lot about tone and the words that you choose when you're talking to people. If you take it from an educational perspective rather than from you're like a threatening perspective, like you're not in compliance and you could get a lawsuit, right? That's scarier than trying to take the positive spin on things. And so that's kind of what I've always tried to do with the folks that I work with. And a lot of times the folks that I work with were from an employer standpoint are the people that are trying to make things better and they're trying to gain more understanding. So it's usually less confrontational now than it would have been before. Before I would have just let the attorneys handle it if it got to that point, right? But I would try to present options for people, whether that was, for the deaf community, it's about reasonable accommodations. And it's about ADA compliance and people understanding their rights, right? So again, for me, it was taking more of an action step on the education side and giving people tools to advocate for themselves. And then working with the employers who are in a space to say, we know we need help with this, and providing those educational opportunities.
And how has that changed over the years? Because this has been like I was born in the 90s, and I would say that was kind of well, actually, I have no idea. I don't know what was going on in the 90s. I was too young. But
Awesome stuff.
yeah. It seems like things have moved pretty quickly. So how has that evolution been from when you started doing this to say today?
Well, really, I haven't been doing this work for that long. I've just done a whole lot of it in a short period of time. So I probably started doing a lot of this work, 5 or 6 years ago. And at that time, and really over the past several years, there have been really just a lot more advocates that have spoken out publicly, et cetera, et cetera. So it's opened up the business sector to have more diversity and inclusion directors and have that be a big focus of what they're doing. And quite honestly, the past several years, with the unemployment rate being as low as it has been, employers have to work so much harder to attract talent from all sorts of populations, whereas before maybe they didn't have to think about that. So creating inclusive cultures has been something that has been so much more of a return on investment for a lot of employers if they're doing it right. And if you can teach them ways to do it in an affordable way. A lot of the inclusive practices that I talk about with people are simply changing the way that you're wording something on your website, or offering accommodations, or ERG group, employee resource groups, like there's a lot of very inexpensive things that employers can do. And they just need help understanding what that looks like. So I think that the unemployment rate being as low as it has really helped a lot to incentivize companies to pay attention. And then I just swoop in and try to help as much as I can.
When you go and work with a company, what are some of like the common like pitfalls? Like what are the obvious things that they're like obviously doing incorrectly that you go in and help? Like what are some of the things that are kind of quote unquote quick fixes, right? You mentioned something, changing the wording on a website or something like that.
Yeah, so it always depends on which cultural communities that they're looking to build stronger ties with. So like specifically the deaf and hard of hearing community. If in your job descriptions, in every job description at the bottom, you put, email, whatever email address to request an accommodation or to request an interpreter, or interpreters provided upon request, that's a huge signifier to deaf people that the company really wants to work with them, right? And it's the same thing with multilingual people, right? We talk about the Latinx population and a lot of Spanish speaking people here, even just in Marion County, and it's having bilingual job postings, or on the job postings, saying English preferred or Spanish welcome, or, things like that. There's little tiny things like just changing a job description and adding one extra line can be a huge signifier for people that the company wants to talk to them. One of the things that I did with Indy Pride that I'm really proud of is I created, and over the past couple of years, organized the very first Indy Pride LGBTQ plus career fair. And so it was the first very specific LGBTQ plus recruitment event really here in the state of Indiana. And the very first year that we hosted it, we had about 20 of the area's kind of like largest, most notable employers in different sectors, because I wanted to offer a huge variety of types of positions that people could apply for, or skill sets, right? So, you had companies like Allison Transmission, Eli Lilly, Newfields was there, Indigo was there, the Morales Group, Old National Bank. It was all of these different sectors. And what we wanted to do, very specifically for the LGBTQ plus community, it is still legal for an organization to discriminate against an LGBTQ plus person. And so we wanted to bring, for me, my goal, I wanted to bring together employers that very intentionally said, we are not doing that. We really want you to come and apply at our company, and to do that in a very public way, right? And so allowing employers to do that. And one of the things that I did with that event was also I create basically a marketing campaign around the inclusive practices that some of these employers are doing. So an inclusive practice for the LGBTQ plus community is adding sexual orientation and gender identity to an anti-discrimination policy, and being very forward about that, having that policy posted in a lot of different places, like in your careers pages. There's things like that where we can showcase what other employers are doing to say, this community is absolutely welcome in our company. We're doing everything that we can to make sure that we're creating an inclusive environment for them. And again, in that specific example, it's literally just making sure that you're adding those protections in your company in a very straightforward way, and communicating to people that it's important to you. So it was things like that where I really tried to showcase what people are doing, so that other employers could consider taking those actions as well.
And did you say that it is currently still legal to discriminate employers? Can you explain a little bit more about exactly what that means? So when you say someone's just being discriminatory against somebody within their hiring practices, like what does that look like?
It can be hiring practices, it can be firing practices. You'll see a lot more. There's several lawsuits right now in the Supreme Court where they're looking at how discrimination has affected different LGBTQ people. In the workplace, typically that looks like firing, because it's a little bit harder to prove that you weren't hired because of that. And so it's sexual orientation and gender identity are not covered under protected classes. And so what the courts are trying to do is they're trying to tie sexual orientation and gender identity to the protected class of sex or gender. And so what they're trying to say is if someone fired you, Fabian, because they didn't fire you because you're gay, but they fired you because you're a man that loves another man and not a woman that loves another man. So that's how they're trying to kind of like tie that together, right? And so it's this really interesting kind of wordplay and just the way that people interpret the law, but it's still currently legal for employers to fire someone because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And that's what the community's been fighting for really the past several years.
And I'm going to sound really naive or ignorant, but like, is that actually like, are people actually doing that?
Very much so.
Like it's 2020, you know what I mean? And maybe that's where my shock comes from. But the fact that somebody would purposefully fire somebody for their sexual orientation, just like in my mind, I don't see how that situation plays itself out. Right. Like,
and that's probably because much like me, you are surrounded by a lot of really great progressive and inclusive people. Right. But it kind of comes back to Haley, what you said earlier, being exposed to people that are in different situations, that are in different companies, that are in different cultural climates. It happens quite a bit. And it's even things like when you think about employee benefits. So does a company's employee benefits, if I'm married to a woman, does that cover my wife? Does that, if I have a longtime partner, does it cover my partner? Will it cover maternal leave if my wife has a baby, but I want to take off work to spend time with her? You know what I mean? There's like all these different things that unless you're a part of the community, you just you may not think about, right? It can also be smaller things like maybe at the Christmas party, they ask that you only bring spouses. Well, what if before marriage was legalized, what did that mean for a lot of LGBTQ plus people, right? There's all sorts of these little things that there's simple wording and simple policies that can be tweaked to make sure that they're much more inclusive. But these things happen on a very regular basis, unfortunately.
Where would you rank like Indiana or Indianapolis? Maybe let's go with Indianapolis. In how like progressive the companies here are. Is it like pretty widespread? Is it pretty progressive? Like, where's it at?
So I'm sure this is going to shock you, but Indianapolis, like Marion County, is the progressive area of Indiana. So there's a lot of companies here who are doing a lot of work that are very inclusive and are very progressive, right? But we see companies that get further out in the state, et cetera, that's where maybe you see a lot more of those practices, Fabian, that you were kind of asking about. And we have really great employers like Eli Lilly and Anthem and companies like that have been working on this for a while and that have the resources to put a lot of measures in place to make sure that they're doing the right thing. And those are the major players in the area, right? So you see a lot of larger businesses that have a lot more resources and that are a lot more thoughtful and intentional about some of those progressive values. So here in Marion County, that may lessen just a little bit, whereas once you get further out, that may be just different depending on the cultural climate. Does that make sense?
Definitely. It's you think that it would be such a simple solution, and then you're coming up with all these things that I would have never even considered. And again, it's back to understanding, everyone's situation, but just the insurance policies. And do insurance companies offer those like adjustments that you can make, or is that okay? So that they do, it's like presented to you.
I'm sure and I'm sure that's different between insurance carriers too, right? Maybe it costs more to cover more people. So maybe the employer has to make the conscious decision to add that into their policy, right? And so then it's the employer going the extra mile to make sure that they're taking care of all of their employees. I don't know that much about all of the benefits. I just know that there's opportunities to make them better. But yeah, it's definitely an option.
How did you get connected with working with Indy Pride?
So that was working with the law firm still. And when that's when some of those cases started going through some of the circuit courts.
Mm-hmm.
And I started paying more attention, and I, like you, was shocked to find out that LGBTQ people were still not protected under the law. That's when I also realized that LGBTQ plus people typically face more legal challenges. So for instance, if you're an LGBTQ plus family, you need to have a surrogate or adopt, you have a lot more family law issues. Also, you'll have some partners, depending on if or when they got married, that maybe a will and trust wouldn't hold up in court if one of the partners passed away. And there's a lot more family tension that's around that. So you have to have a lot tighter planning documents. There's a much higher prevalency of substance abuse challenges for the LGBTQ plus community. And that comes with a variety of different legal challenges. There's all sorts of things. Any population that's marginalized in any way has a higher need for more types of legal services. So at that time, that's when I joined the Indy Pride board and was just like, how can I dive in and help? That's where my relationship with Indy Pride started. And from there, I don't even know what happened. I just became the organization.
Yeah. And you're director of marketing and communications there, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so, I've never been to Indy Pride Festival. I've got a
Missing
lot of,
out.
I
How
know.
did you miss Lizzo last year?
That was like riding the wave, like right before it crested and she like blew up into stardom. I feel like I hadn't heard about her at all. And everybody's like, oh, Lizzo this, Lizzo that. Because if you follow like certain people on social media, you kind of like know what's going on in the city. And so a lot of people posted about it. I was like, huh, Lizzo, never heard of her. And then 5-6 months later, it was like everywhere.
How did I miss it? Yeah.
Exactly. It's like there's so many times where it's like I wish I could go back in time, like just to go experience that. But yeah, to talk a little bit about the festival, the importance of it here in Indy, especially when you think about LGBTQ plus, just that whole topic in the city of Indianapolis. Like the first thing that comes to mind, I think everybody knows what we're talking about, is the whole RIFRA thing with Mike Pence, right? So to know that thing has grown and doubled, under your tutelage there as director of marketing and communications, and continues to grow, like things just don't seem like they mesh, right? Or like that would go hand in hand.
Yeah.
A little bit more about that.
So let me just set the stage for what's happened over the past several years. So right before I joined the board, the organization had been run 100% by volunteer work. There was no paid employees. Nobody got paid to do literally any of the work that they did to produce a massive festival, a giant parade, and community events. We also say that Indy Pride hosts not only the parade and the festival, but between the beginning of May and the festival, Indy Pride produces 13 annual community events. Wow. Ranging from, there's a 5K, there's Pet Pride, there's a music and movie night where Indy Pride of Bands does a concert outside. There's all sorts of these like connection events that are tied to Pride Month activities or Pride Month events. 100% of that work was done by people in their spare time before our executive director, Chris Handberg, was hired. So Chris came on about 6 months before I joined the board. And he and I have worked together really closely over the past several years to make some really smart decisions and just really try to put a lot of great opportunities in place. You mentioned Lizzo. One of the reasons why we were able to book Lizzo, one, it was great timing, and some of it was absolutely luck. The right person, right place, right time. But we had also built relationships with local media stations, with local radio stations, and they were a big part of allowing us to book an artist like that and bring her here, right? And so it was also the work that we had done to build those partnerships up. So when I came on, I volunteered for the very first year in the full position.
And what
And
was that?
I'm sorry,
What year was that?
that would have been 2.5 years ago. And I came on and Chris was like, hey, will you be our director of marketing and communications? And I was like, what does that mean? And he's like, oh, you just like post on our Facebook and help us with like social media stuff. And I was like, are you sure that's it? And he's like, yeah, it'll be fine. And I'm like, okay. Greatest bait and switch of all time, Chris Handberg. And for me, it's also like when I jump into something, I want to do it really well. And I want to like go, just all out. And I just want it to be as fantastic as I can make it. And so that very first year, I spent so much time running Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So 4 social media platforms. In addition to that, we did a full rebranding of the organization and launched a brand new website. And then it was just like, I had never done anything like that. I had never really done event promotion. And all of a sudden I'm doing all of these like graphic designs and event promotion for like all of these crazy events. And I was like, I just like dove right in. So after the first year, I told Chris, I was just like, we really need to have someone in this. It's not sustainable to have a volunteer do this work if you want it to be done well. Like, I'm dying. And it wasn't an ultimatum. I'm like, you don't have to pay me. You can pay me, because at the time I was contracting out work. And so I was like, but we need to have somebody do it where it's part of their income and they can put dedicated time to it. And so after that first year, I stepped off the board and we got a contract in place. And then I became like a part-time staff employee that's contracted. And honestly, between Chris doing all of the work that he's done to build really solid relationships in the community, before, when it was all volunteers, you would have new people every year, every other year that would come in that would reach out to the organizations and would have to reorganize things and keep track of things. So having just one full-time employee in place has, to your original question, been able to allow the organization to grow so much. And then for me, it's like being able to communicate that in an effective way to the community, build engagement, and build regular opportunities for us to get in front of our audience and really build that, engage with them in a much more meaningful way. That's where over that second year, we saw so much more just like commitment, people from, coming to events regularly, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, like having Lizzo last year definitely helped. But it was also, we didn't have people that just came for the Lizzo concert at the end of the day, right? We had, so in 2018, we had about 25,000 people through the gates. And that was also with a mandatory weather evacuation. Can I just tell you how many things I've been through with this organization? Like, in the middle of the festival, we have this giant, like, crazy storm come through. We have to evacuate everyone from the premises. And then the gates were just completely open for an hour for people to come in. So we don't really have an accurate head count for the number of people that were there, or really the number of tickets that we would have sold if that wouldn't have happened. But in 2018, we had about 25,000 people. And last year we had just over 50,000 people. Wow. And it was just crazy to see that growth, right? And it has to do with a lot of those things being in place, the regular communications about things. And we saw all of our community events grow as well. So really, it's just continuing to grow the audience, and between Chris doing partnerships and really building those solid relationships over and over again, and then being able to regularly communicate those things to the community, we've just seen tremendous activation in LGBTQ plus people and allies alike, right? It's awesome.
Has there been anything that's any like company or partnership that has surprised you that you would have thought like, oh my gosh, I would have never guessed that this company or these people would have been so down for the cause?
Like a sponsor or something?
Potential. I mean, I don't know how a partnership works or what that means for like your world.
Yeah. Well, for the Pride world, it's been, so let me think about it a different way. So rather than like a sponsorship or like a company coming in, we have companies from all, like every background that you can think of. I mean, we have yoga studios that want to do a class with us, or people that want to do events and activation opportunities with us all the time, restaurants, everything. The thing that to me was really interesting was last year and the year before, we had our very first Deaf Pride. And this was where, like I was talking about earlier, my worlds collided, right? So we have an abnormally large deaf population here in Indianapolis because we have a nationally renowned school for the deaf on the northeast side of the city. And we have an LGBTQ population that's deaf and hard of hearing. And they wanted to become more involved and create an event just for them. And we did it. It was fabulous. Last year we had Deafies in Drag, which are these deaf drag queens come in. It was amazing. And it's things like that. You may not even I know, it was awesome.
So wait, what did they dance? Like, what was it, the same as a drag show, or was it, I gotta dive into this. What is this?
Oh, just look it up on YouTube. There are tons and tons of videos. They are hilarious. And I mean, they're just like a lot of other, I mean, a lot of it wasn't music, although deaf people love music. They just listen to it really, really loud because then they can feel it. But it's just, you gotta look it up on YouTube. They're hilarious.
Okay.
But yeah, so we had, the first year we had drag queens and it was all music and it was more local performers than anything. Last year we actually contracted Deafies and Drag to come out. But it was really incredible to see all of the deaf and hard of hearing community members that came out, all of the allies come out, and everybody just rallied around all of these performers, and it was so fabulous.
So
yeah.
Hold it up. Is that them?
Yes.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
So this
so do they use sign language?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they're deaf drag performers.
I mean, it shouldn't be that shocking, but there's some, I think oh, sorry. My animal's in here with me. But the thing with drag is that it's very theatric and musical. So it's cool that, they found a way to make it inclusive to everyone. But so a question I've been having this whole time is, what do you tell people who have never been to an indie or a Pride event? Sorry, just a Pride event period, and may be new to that kind of concept, or what do you tell them to encourage them to come to an event?
Really, for me, it's if you're a member of the community, it's just about connecting with more like-minded people, right? Sometimes we have people that come from all over the state and sometimes even the region. And especially a lot of people who live in smaller towns who may not have regular places where they feel like they can get together with other queer people, right? So really it's about community connection. And because Indy Pride does all of those events that are kind of tailored to different parts of the community, then it gives people an opportunity to be in a space that's appropriate for them. So if you really want a family-friendly event, we have, these 4 events where tons of people bring their kids, or Deafies and Drag is very specific to a cultural community. Last year, we did our very first Buy and Pan Pride, so more Buy and Pan people coming together. So it gives, with all of those smaller events, it gives more people the opportunity to find something that may be a little bit more comfortable for them than a giant all-day festival, right? And so we'll find people who have never been, will kind of dip their toe in the water with that, or maybe they'll come to the parade and then decide to come to the festival or things like that. So Indy Pride has did a really good job of trying to make sure that we take a look at all of the different characteristics of our community. And we just try to find things that are going to make people really feel like there's a place for them to be seen and embraced, and they just can be super comfortable and they can meet other people like them. So that's a really long way to answer your question, that there's a lot of opportunities for people just depending on what it is they're looking for. And there's always a place where people can find a way to fit in. At least that's what we aim for.
One of the questions that we ask, people before they come on the show is why do you choose to work here in Indianapolis? And your answer was that there's so much opportunity for change in the region. And I think that kind of coincides with what you're doing at Luna. And you talked a little bit about, in your answer, you gave a few statistics. And one of the ones that jumped out at me was that we have one of the fastest growing foreign-born populations in the country, which
Yeah.
is kind of insane to think about. So if you can explain a little bit in more detail when you talk about opportunity for change in the region, maybe dive in a little bit more on some of those statistics.
Yeah, so with the foreign-born population, so I want you to think about Indiana in general as a place for people to start over, right? The cost of living is extremely low. There's a ton of different types of industry here where people can apply skill sets. And there's a lot of really great community organizations that are here to support people, right? And so Indiana has become a big state for refugee resettlement because of those reasons, right? So one of the biggest refugee populations that we have here in not just Marion County, but in central Indiana is the Burmese population. So outside of the actual country of Burma or Myanmar, Indiana holds the largest concentration of Burmese people in the entire world outside of their actual native country. And it's because so many people were sent here. And then as that happens, these communities grow, and then more people feel comfortable going where they can talk to or relate to more people. And so that has grown significantly. So we have a really big population here on the south side of Indianapolis that's also spreading more throughout Indianapolis. And then there's a really big population up in Fort Wayne. And we're seeing more people as they become more comfortable spreading out throughout the state a lot more. It's literally on the other side of the world.
Just so, like, when I first heard this, when we talked to Marina, I didn't know where Burma was.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that there's other folks out there like myself.
Yeah.
Just wanted to give a visual for anybody that's watching.
Yeah. We also have a very large Haitian population that's here. We have a very large African population. So lots of folks coming from South Africa, Nigeria. And like I said, because Indianapolis has become kind of a place where people can start over a lot easier than if you go to a state where it's harder to find work or the cost of living is just astronomical. It's just become a really great place for folks. So with that in mind, one of the statistics that I like to put out there is right now, from data that came from a census poll in, I think it was 2018, 13.5% of residents in Marion County speak a language other than English at home. Like, that's significant, right? There's a huge population of people here, and that's just Marion County. So think about also like the surrounding donut counties. There's a huge population of people here where they may speak some level of English, but they 100% prefer to speak a different language at home. And what that tells us is there's a lot of opportunity for employers, businesses, whatever that looks like, organizations, to start including more of these folks in those inclusive practices, really working to give people new opportunities. And when you remove language barriers from the work that people are already fully capable of doing, but maybe they just don't have the right certification or they don't have the right language to transfer that here, you give people an opportunity to thrive. I'll give you a specific example. The Morales Group is a company that I work with pretty closely. It's a staffing company, and they very specifically focus on recruiting immigrants and refugees and trying to find job opportunities for them, more specifically in warehousing and logistics. But it's something that they really focus on. It was like their fifth employee or something like that, was this woman who came over from somewhere in South America. Now I can't remember which country it was. Her husband had passed away. She was a physician in South America. And when she came here, she came here because family was here. And there were, she would have had to do like school, certification, boards, everything all over again just to be able to practice medicine here. And it wasn't feasible for her, especially with the astronomical price of doing that, right? Plus the language barrier for her to learn all of the correct terminology or the English terminology, et cetera. So she ended up just getting a job with Morales Group, and they realized just how intelligent and skilled she was. And she quickly became really important to them and worked her way up through the company. I can't remember what position she holds now, but it was something where they just saw that potential in her, and gave her the opportunity to thrive. And she just like wrapped her arms around it. Right. So I think when we just take the language out of it and we look at people as human beings or skill sets or however you want to kind of frame that, then we give people the opportunity to apply those skill sets to contribute to the community or contribute to their job or whatever that looks like in a way that they fully can. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I mean, and also adds just to the diversity of their culture, which makes it even more appealing for others to kind of come in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We see a lot of the companies that recruit from those populations. You recruit one or two people, and then all of a sudden, neighbors and friends, and if they've built a good environment, they'll do a lot more internal recruiting, which again for a company can decrease their investment into recruitment because it's kind of doing it itself.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So we're closing in on an hour here. We might be moving into rapid fire. Is there anything that Haley that I haven't asked that you want to ask, or Tiffany, is there anything that you want to make sure that we hit on before we move on?
I would say, so it's hard because you really have, I mean, you've been in like the Latino or like worked in the, with the Latin group. I mean, there's just so much on here, but I think, like, I like to leave people with some sort of like action item or something that they can be thinking about. So what is something that, maybe like, what are you working on most right now? Like, what is most pertinent to you with like diversity and inclusion that, people can be aware of and maybe hop on that bandwagon for and help like push whatever that initiative is forward?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest thing that I can suggest to allies, everybody's an ally to every other community that they're not a part of, right? Is just self-education. One of the boards that I sit on is the Diversity Roundtable of Central Indiana, and we host monthly events where we provide education opportunities for people from any background to come and learn about whatever topic. I am very, very grateful to be the professional development director, and I get to choose and curate the topics and the speakers, which is super fun. And so for me, I get to like really showcase some different topics around diversity and inclusion. And one of those, so like one of the things that I'm really excited about, Rima Shahid, who used to be the executive director of the Indiana Muslim Alliance, and she's now the executive director for Women for Change. She's gonna host a session in April. We're turning it into a webinar. Host a session in April talking about Islamic culture and the Muslim community and how to create a more inclusive workplace for this population. We don't necessarily automatically think about religion in the workplace when we think about diversity and inclusion, because we're like, we don't talk about religion in the workplace, right? And I'm like, well, y'all have Christmas off? Do all your employees get Christmas off? So you kind of do, right? And it's things like that. Again, you don't like think about those things until you're like, that's not part of your culture. So I think for me, an action item for people is to just really start thinking about all of the facets of their personality or their cultural background or characteristics, and then go a step further and think about people that are different than them or characteristics that are different than from things that they know, and self-educate, man. Like there are so many ways to educate yourself through podcasts or TED Talks or whatever, but just really start like making it an intentional personal growth opportunity to just learn about things that are outside of what your bubble looks like. And I think it just starts to really open up the world to you to understand just how different parts of the world can be, or different people can be, right? And for me, that's super interesting. But for other people, it may also just be a way for them to potentially connect with one of their family members, right? A very good friend of mine and an old colleague, he's kind of an older gentleman, came to a talk that I did about how to be a good LGBTQ+ ally. What I found out later was that his daughter had come out to him, and he wanted to be a better dad and be a more inclusive person. And so he was doing that self-education. But as people, naturally, as we start to learn about people, different cultural communities and different characteristics that are different than the lives that we experience, we will recognize that in more people and be able to connect with them about that or ask them about that and do it in a genuine way, right? So if anything, that would be an action item that I could give to every person that would be super easy to accomplish.
I love that. And we're all in quarantine, so there's no excuse not to be watching those YouTube videos.
Seriously. We all have time on our hands. Let's be serious.
Exactly. Be curious.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's thank you. I think that's a perfect segue to some rapid fire. So rapid fire questions. Here we go. I think I'm going to go one a little bit off the cuff, especially with how things are right now. And Haley, you mentioned not making excuses to watch YouTube videos. So with all this extra time that we have, what have you been doing? What have you been binging?
Oh, so a lot of this is going to be totally opposite of all the things I just talked about. A lot of my work gets so serious and can be a little bit like emotionally heavy. And with everything that's happening in the world right now, I'm trying to stay super lighthearted with all of the things that I'm consuming. So like I've been watching a bunch of Schitt's Creek. Have you ever seen that show?
Yes.
It's so funny.
It's so funny.
And it's just so over the top and just absolutely hilarious. So that's a show that's kept me just like kind of sane. One of the other things that I have been doing is really focusing on taking care of myself. I mentioned this earlier, talked to my therapist about this a lot, but like I spend so much time worrying about other people. And like I said, I'm a high empath. And so I have to very intentionally think about taking care of myself. And so that's been a lot more doing at-home workouts with Orange Theory and Peloton are the two apps that I'm using right now to do workouts and hold myself accountable, or taking long walks, or just like taking time for myself through this whole thing has also been something that's become even more important to me because I'm not distracted by going to events or doing things in the evening or things like that. And so that's been something that has been really important. One of the things that I do normally outside of the craziness is I feel like one of the only ways for me to like stop working is to literally like leave the state. And so I regularly take trips and I regularly take personal retreats. And on those retreats, I typically read 2 or 3 books while I'm gone. My favorite place to go is Cancun and just do an all-inclusive. And literally in an all-inclusive, you just have to exist. Like you don't have to think about when, like making, meal reservations, or you can like roll over and take a nap and then roll over and go get a hamburger and then roll over and, you know what I mean? It's just like, you just have to like decide what you want to do in that moment. And so I regularly take personal retreats down to Cancun and just exist for a couple of days and bring a couple books. And so that's where I got even more of my like personal growth and reading time in is when I'm not currently here at home. And now I'm stuck at home. So that's challenging too.
Yeah. Man, when I think of a personal retreat, I think of like a cabin. I've never considered Cancun, and now I want to do a personal retreat.
Well, and if you look at the affordability of it, I mean, I can usually go everything all included. That's also why I do all inclusive for like, it's like $1,000 maybe for like 4 or 5 days. When you look at the cost per day, if you're going to go somewhere else, if you're going to drive and do hotel and do food and do entertainment, like that kind of adds up anyway. And so it's a lot cheaper than you think it would be. And you can always find really good deals. So it's just an easy place to go. And like I said, to just like exist.
And shout out to Schitt's Creek, specifically the episode where they're cooking and she talks about folding in the cheese.
Folding the cheese. He says, what do? Fold it in half like a piece of paper and put it in?
Each one individually. Come on, David, just try and keep it.
Just fold it in. Yeah.
I'm going to have to start watching that again. I've been doing Curb Your Enthusiasm, so I need to go back to that, but it's a good one. Larry David's my favorite.
For sure.
Okay, so if you weren't quarantined, obviously, where would be like your secret spot or like little getaway that you would be at in Indianapolis, maybe right now?
So in Indy, one of the places that I like to go on my own is going down to Brown County, to the state park down there. They have hiking trails really, I actually hike on the biking trails. I'm just very conscious about if there's bikers like really getting out of the way so that I'm not impeding their biking trail. But they have this one really long trail. It's called the Schooner Trail. And I can barely like walk it. It's like super challenging. I don't know how people do it on bikes. It's crazy, but it's really long. Almost nobody is on it all the time. Like, and so anytime I get down there, that's like a really easy, it's like a 2-hour hike, super quiet. You're back in the middle of nowhere. And so that's a really solid way for me to just like escape and unplug. And then I'm also, just because I worked in hospitality for so long, I'm an avid restaurant goer, right? I really love local restaurant culture. I love all the local chefs that we have. Several friends of mine own restaurants. And so it's been really nice to support and explore all the restaurant culture and how that's grown. And so a lot of times that's kind of how I spend my night and weekend time too, is supporting local restaurant industries.
So give us a good recommendation, like an off the beaten path. These people make amazing, diverse food, like multicultural food that people typically wouldn't go to. That isn't like, your Bluebeard's. Not that there's anything wrong with Bluebeard. I love it myself, but like just something people wouldn't think about.
Yeah. So one of the places that I really love going is Yukio, which is Neil Brown's sushi spot and ramen. He has done a fantastic job of really putting time and effort into understanding Japanese cuisine and how to do sushi really well in a very clean way. Not that I don't love like fried things and eel sauce and cream cheese and all the things, but it's just like his sushi is very much like you get the beautiful delicacy of the fish and some potentially pickled veggies and some avocado. You know what I mean? It's just like, it's all just like very fresh and clean. And the other thing that he does that I love there is that, so typically wasabi paste that we associate with sushi is actually grated horseradish. And then it has green dye in it. Like that's what that is.
Ew.
And so that's why you get that like that crazy like sinus thing, right? So one of the things that Neil does is he actually will grate freshly grated horseradish alongside, the ginger and the wasabi paste and stuff for people to use. And when you have freshly grated horseradish, it's actually very delicate and very light, and it's a really nice accompaniment with very natural sushi, where you just want a tiny, tiny bit of that horseradish, but not like a kick in the face. And so, yeah, he puts together really beautiful food. And so that's probably one of my favorite spots right now. I also, one of my biggest comfort food spots is Siam Square. Not that that's really off the beaten path, but it's just like, even the other day, like I was like, okay, DoorDash, I'm like, is Siam Square open? And so I spent a crazy amount of money on a really like lavish Thai feast, but it's like my comfort food is Siam Square. So whenever I'm feeling anxious or something, then, or even like getting over being sick or something, that's like my go-to.
Sounds
Thai
delicious.
food's amazing.
Now I'm starving. Thanks.
I know. I actually just pulled up the menu for Yukio. So
yeah.
Two more, Haley.
Sure.
So I think it's on you.
I asked about the secret spot. Oh, you asked for a recommendation. Okay. All right. Let me think. Okay. What is a book or like that has inspired you recently?
So,
or something you've read?
Yeah, I'll give you two actually. One is called The Art of Gathering. And it is something, as somebody who does a lot of event planning and trying to bring people together, it was something I actually started reading on my last vacation before the world went crazy. And because now I've gone from being a very public, active, community-driven person to being at home all the time, it's given me a lot more insights into how we connect with people when we're together. Even like I've done a couple of virtual like happy hours or exercise events or things recently, but it's like given me a lot to think about when you take a look at how people get together, why we get together, and having more intentionality around that, right? So one of the most annoying things in the whole world is a networking event where you're literally just like handing out business cards to people. Like, great, what's the point? And so being able to put together events where people can connect with each other in an intentional way, giving people a reason to come to that event outside of like meeting random people. It's like there's a lot of ways that people can take things that we normally do and really hone in on the intention behind the meeting, and then create a little bit of structure and a little bit of like an opportunity for people to engage on a deeper level. And I find that fascinating. So that book has been great. The other book that I read recently that I have really enjoyed is Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. I'm like in love with Trevor Noah. If this ever gets to him, Trevor Noah, I love you. I love everything about that man. Yes, please send it to him. Just like his background, how compassionate he is, how intelligent he is, how he explains things, kind of like I talked about earlier, without being confrontational, but just like explaining things. And for me, that book, it talks about, a lot of it is just his story of growing up in South Africa under apartheid. And he is literally born like less than 2 weeks from me, like our birthdays. We're basically like the same person. Let's be serious. I wish. But we're born like, so he was born in South Africa and lived under apartheid. I was born in Kokomo, Indiana, in a super white homogenous community, right? That's protected from all of the evils of the world. And just to read his story and to think about how we're the same age and how different our upbringings were, was just really fascinating for me. And he looks at things in a very interesting perspective. Obviously, he brings a lot of humor to what he does, but also really great storytelling and a lot of compassion. And he tries to pull out like cultural relevancy and understanding in the way that he writes and the way that he tells stories. And that book was just like, I love that book. So that's probably the second one that I've really loved recently that hasn't been like super nerdy.
Awesome.
I love that. I'm actually definitely, I think that one's a good, like almost lighthearted one to watch, right? Or listen to or read, I guess would be the right one. But
the audio version that he actually reads it himself.
Yeah, that's why as you're saying this, I was looking it up just to see. Yeah, I'm totally diving into that.
Yeah. And a friend of mine had suggested when I got Michelle Obama's book, she was like, read the book, but get the audio book and listen to her at the same time that you're reading. And she had done the same thing. I lent her my copy of Born a Crime, and she said she did the same thing. And it's just so much more impactful when you can hear his voice and all this, especially because it's predominantly storytelling, right? So.
Oh, that's awesome. So he does read it himself.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, last question here. Who would you recommend as a future guest for our podcast?
So one person that I've really been able to grow a really solid relationship with and is doing some really awesome work in the community is Jordan Rodriguez with the city of Indianapolis. He's the director of international and Latino affairs. He essentially created his position because of his advocacy specifically for that population, and has done some really incredible work. He's also just like a really warm and funny and awesome person. If you get a chance, really interview him and his wife, Angie, at the same time. She's also a really incredible person. She does a lot of work in the school systems, and together they're like that like power couple dream team of doing really, really impactful work in the community. One of the things that Jordan has done that I've been really excited to be a part of this year is he, through his position with the city, he partnered with Gloria Jimenez, who's the executive director of the Indiana Latino Expo. And they created an Axis mentor, like a leadership development program for young Latinx professionals. There was nothing like it in the city. There's some professional development groups or programs that are for people who are already kind of like in their career, right? And this is really for, people who are in their early 20s who are just like starting to figure the world out. So they're in their second year. I was very honored to be asked by them to actually be a mentor this year. So I have a mentee who is amazing. And as someone who is not Latinx, I was just like blown away by the fact that they wanted me to do that. I'm like, are you sure? They're like, yes, please. But they have just made some really cool moves in the city. And Jordan has really been a driving force in making some changes and making sure that that's something that is a priority and that things get implemented in the city.
That's awesome. Great last name too.
Yeah, right.
Well, Tiffany, this has been awesome having you on. I want to give you an opportunity to shout out any any place that people can go for resources, either to find out more about you or some of the things that you're involved with.
Yeah, so Indy Pride has a very robust social media presence. I would know because I run all of it. So check out all of, we're at Indy Pride. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. One of the things that we're doing right now is a People of Pride campaign where people can submit, there's a submission form on the website. They submit their first name, last name is optional, their pronouns, a photo, and then a quote up to 140 characters about their personal pride. And then every day we put that into an image and we post one of those to just represent different community members throughout Indy Pride. So that's been really fun. Yes, there's my Instagram feed. You can see, so all of those pink images, looks like a little checkerboard now. All those pink images are different images that just like give people details about awesome community members and what's important to them. That's so it's something that I'm really proud of. And I feel like I kind of like am represented through all of the work that I do. So you can find information about Luna Language Services on social media. You can also go to luna360.com to get a better understanding of, what their services are and some of those opportunities. I am very, very active on LinkedIn. I post a lot of my community engagement on LinkedIn as well as my Facebook. And I am just at Tiffany Hanson, Hanson, on both platforms. You can find me on Instagram too, but I don't post nearly as much on there. So
you have enough.
Oh my God, I know, right? Yeah.
Well, Tiffany, thank you so much. This has been delightful. And thank you for the work that you do in the community.
It's my pleasure. If there's any links that I can get you or any ways that I can connect you to some of the speakers that you're looking for, definitely let me know.
No, absolutely. Again, this is so awkward, right? As we like to say, drink culture, know your city. We're out.